welcome back to Friend Crush. I'm your host, Amber Akilla, DJ, creative consultant, podcaster. I'm on TikTok also now, so follow me on everything at Amber Akilla and this account, friend.crush on Instagram. I hope everyone is doing well. I wanted to record this because I literally just had this realization while I was driving, and I was thinking about superficial self-care versus spiritual self-care, because I feel like these two things are often conflated and they're confused as being the same thing. And it's not people's fault that that is the case, because I feel like, as I like to say often, we live in a society and making money is what is valued most in a capitalist society. So people will do all things, whatever is necessary to get their coin. And for me, I feel like it's difficult to look at everything through like a moral binary, like is it right or is it wrong, is it good or is it bad? Everything just is, and each person plays a small part in building the fabric of society. For most of us, I imagine anybody that is listening to this right now, you probably aren't a multi-billionaire who is exploiting hundreds or thousands of people for minimum wage. So capitalism is a thing that exists. It is a system in which we live, and we're all just trying to find ways to survive and then thrive, because Maslow's hierarchy of needs, etc., just like basic human principles, once you have your base needs covered, I think then you have the room to focus on individuation and self-actualization. So it is a privilege to be able to question the world around you, to be able to get in tune with who you are in a context where surviving is difficult for a lot of people. So I really feel like if you have the time and the space and the resources and the access to information and tools that can help you get in touch with your authentic self, that can help you to live your best life, distinguish between what's expected of you and what you want, distinguish between what you want for yourself, what other people want from you, and being able to draw boundaries. That's so important. It's important for everybody, no matter what your context is, but I think it is easier, or the barriers to it are lessened when you have material privilege. But I also say that material privilege maxes out at a certain point, and everywhere you go, there you are. So that's why you shouldn't compare yourself to other people. Okay, anyway, I'm getting into rant territory. Let's get back to the topic. Superficial self-care versus spiritual self-care. Now, in today's landscape, social media, etc., dominant narrative focuses a lot on superficial self-care. So there's nothing wrong with superficial self-care. I think it is a really important part of life, but I feel like it's very easy to focus only on superficial self-care at the expense of spiritual self-care, or at the neglect of spiritual self-care. So a lot of the times when people think about self-care, they think about the wellness industry, they think about putting on a face mask, taking a bath, doing yoga, exercising, eating a healthy diet, drinking certain teas, taking supplements, skincare, etc., etc. Those are things that I think fall under the superficial self-care umbrella. Buying incense, buying crystals, all that kind of stuff. It involves a lot of things, superficial self-care most of the time. And it is important because you live in a physical body, so maintenance of your physical health is really important. But I think that spiritual self-care is something that you cannot purchase. It's not like, oh, I've bought skincare and used it and then my skin has improved, right? That's something that you've bought. But spiritual self-care to me is something that requires your time and effort, and it can be facilitated with the purchase of certain tools, but the purchase of those tools does not equate to any spiritual growth, if that makes sense. So the analogy that I came up with is like, think of yourself like a phone, an iPhone, for example. You have a physical body, which is the hardware of the phone, and then you have a spiritual self, which is the software of the phone. The two things exist in tandem in order for the phone to function. And you cannot fix a hardware issue with software updates, and you cannot fix software issues with hardware updates. The same way that you cannot fix a physical problem, a superficial problem, with just spiritual self-care, and you can't fix spiritual needs, heal spiritual wounds with just superficial and physical self-care methods. The two things exist together to make you a healthy, happy person living their best life. And focusing just on one or the other means that can come at the expense of the other thing. And just, I feel like your life's journey, everybody's life journey, is to develop an understanding of how these practices can fit into their life, how they can integrate them, and how they can find a balance between the two. And at different stages of your life, you're constantly adjusting your approach and your methods according to whatever you're dealing with at the time. So if your iPhone screen is broken, updating the software doesn't fix the fact that your screen is broken, right? If your software is out of date, fixing the screen isn't going to change the fact that the software is out of date. So that's like a loose analogy for how you can think about your physical self and your spiritual self and the way that you need to take care of both of these things. Another analogy is like, if your arm is broken, positive thinking isn't going to fix the arm. You obviously need physical treatment for it, but thinking positively about the outcome of your physical treatment can help facilitate healing, or can make the process of it easier. If you are sad, doing certain things like distracting yourself can help you, but it's not going to heal whatever has caused your sadness, or it's not going to make it just go away. And I think, like, especially now with social media and like literally every trend becoming exploited and marketed and capitalized off, to the point where the initial intention of any movement is completely diluted into a bunch of branded products. It's important to just develop an awareness of how these things happen. And I don't blame people for trying to get their coin, aren't we all? But the relationship that we have with stuff is going to have such a huge impact on the satisfaction that we feel in life, because material privilege always maxes out. So no matter how many skincare products you buy, how many crystals you buy, how many different self-help books you buy, it's not going to heal the parts of you that need to be healed in order for you to grow emotionally, spiritually. So that's like the trap of self-help too. Like, I think a lot of the times we confuse reading self-help with actually doing the work required to help ourselves. But once you've read the book, you need to take what is in the book and implement it into your life. And it's very easily overlooked a lot of the time. Like, I definitely fell into that trap before, thinking that just by virtue of reading and having an awareness that I was actually like making progress. But whenever I was confronted with a challenge, I would end up making the same mistakes because I hadn't fully gotten to a point where I had awareness of the patterns of my behavior. Then you reach a point where you look back on your life and you're reflecting, doing spiritual self-care, and then you realize like, oh, I've been making the same mistake over and over again without even realizing, okay, I have awareness of this. If this situation came up again, how can I approach it differently? How can I be compassionate with my former self, doing what she did with the knowledge that she had, forgive her, and then find a better way to handle similar situations in the future. Because like I mentioned before in another episode, just because you have an awareness of a problem doesn't mean that you'll never have to deal with that problem again, right? The point of awareness and then acceptance is being at peace with the cards that you've dealt and then figuring out how you can play your cards differently if that situation comes up again. So I always use the example of like, just because you deal with one toxic client and you're aware that they're toxic in a work situation doesn't mean that you'll never deal with a toxic client ever again. You need to learn how to deal with people so that you can have a more positive or a healthy work experience. Same with your friendships, same in love, same with having the same fights over and over again with your family. And I think the hard thing is when you are the more aware party, you feel like it's unfair that you know what's wrong and there's like an expectation that you have to do something about it and fix a situation. The other person has no awareness. Why do I have to do the work? But it's like nothing in life is really that fair. And at the end of the day, you can't unsee what you already know. So you may as well find a way to take whatever challenge is in front of you in your stride. And it's hard to do, and it takes practice and it takes time, and you're allowed to be pissed off and annoyed. But I mean, for me personally, it's just like once you have the awareness and once you've had enough practice dealing with shitty situations and shitty people, you just get better at it, and then the stakes get higher. But that also means that I think the rewards get higher, or there is more payoff from it. So another analogy or framework that I came up with in the past is like the 4 stages of realizing things. Usually I think about this in the context of people who are just realizing that racism exists or misogyny exists or inequality exists. You start off with awareness. Suddenly you realize that there is an issue. Oh, racism exists, for example. Then you're angry because you're like, oh my God, that's so unfair. The injustice is everywhere. Once you have awareness of something, it's like you can't unsee. Now you see it everywhere. Before, where you didn't see that racism existed, now you see it everywhere and you're pissed off. So that anger phase could also just be like any emotional reaction that you might have to something. Then after anger, you have acceptance. And a lot of people get stuck in the anger phase. So like you realize that racism exists and now you just see racism everywhere and you're constantly angry, always feeling the need to call it out, etc., etc. I think it's very easy for people to get stuck there. And I don't blame them because social media profits off outrage and it allows people to see, content that is going to be directed to them with a bias. So, and then media in general also knows that outrage sells. Even though outrage is not a pleasurable feeling per se, it's like familiar to a lot of people. And I think we live in a broken society, so there are a lot of broken people. If anything, that is a default and your life's journey is healing. Anybody that's not aware is going to get stuck in the anger phase. So, but it can just be a stopover. And we can move into acceptance. We live in a society, history is built on, for example, racism and misogyny, the patriarchy, etc., capitalism, exploitation. All these things exist. And our ability to control macro events relies on awareness and intention on micro events. So no one person is going to be able to undo racism in their lifetime, is going to be able to undo misogyny, is going to be able to dismantle the patriarchy or capitalism. But as long as we're doing our best, building awareness and acting more consciously with more empathy and compassion, I think that, we can move in a generally positive direction. But it's really hard to get people on board because it is easy to get stuck in the anger phase. So you get to acceptance, and then after acceptance comes action. What are you going to do differently? And I think, what are you going to do differently with the information that you now know? And that's the hardest part, because when push comes to shove, fight or flight activates, and we are at risk of falling back into familiar patterns. So that's why spiritual self-care is so important, because when you are working on building awareness of your thoughts and your feelings and your patterns of behavior, then you're able to accept yourself for who you are, all of the good, bad, positive, negative, healthy, unhealthy actions, mistakes, lessons, triumphs, achievements, etc. All of the positive, negative traits or expressions of those traits. You can accept yourself, and then you can think of how you can move forward. Because when you don't have awareness, you aren't able to come up with a well-rounded solution. You know what I mean? Like, people who don't understand racism, do not have a full awareness of how racism manifests in society, are never going to be able to come up with a solution that can really address the core issues of racism, right? If you don't have a full understanding of an illness, then all of the treatments that you try to use will not necessarily address the root of the problem, and maybe they'll only address the symptoms. We are currently seeing that with this panini. It's not science's fault that they don't have a full understanding of the virus, but it means that the treatments that are being used are still in like clinical trial phase. We're still figuring out what is best. I'm not making any like conclusive decisions on the vaccine. I'm just saying, as an analogy, when the virus is still considered novel, uncommon, new, then you need to develop awareness and understanding and observe and track so that you can continue to develop more effective treatment. And that takes time, the same way that your spiritual journey takes time too. Nobody is ever really at the end of their journey. It is a journey that ends at death, basically. So don't compare yourself to other people either, because, you know, different people started at different stages. When I read about other people's journey, a lot of the time they are in their like late 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s when they have a spiritual breakthrough. And then they also talk about how, you know, different stages of you might have more than one, different stages of your life. Like, I definitely feel like I can pinpoint, maybe not pinpoint, but like look back at certain periods of my life where I was going through really intense change, and I was feeling like a huge shift in the way that I saw myself and the way that I saw the world. So I have no doubt that at later stages in my life, the same thing will happen again, and my awareness and understanding will change. So I think when you're able to accept yourself and the journey that you've been on, the journey that you're continuing on, it's much easier to have empathy for other people, because you recognize that there are so many things that you couldn't control, but you, at the end of the day, have a choice about how you think about yourself, think about the things that you've been through, think about how you want to live moving forward. That awareness is so important. So awareness, emotional response, anger or otherwise, and then you have acceptance and action. A positive spin might be like when people start to intentionally try to recognize beauty around them. I think this is something that can get really hard to do in such like a visually stimulating digital world a lot of the time, and that's very distraction based as well, and also very like, I don't know what the word is for like being obsessed with being busy, basically. Like, people get so caught up in the overwhelm of day-to-day tasks that they're unable to see and appreciate and cultivate gratitude for the things in life, for the beauty that exists around them. They lose the ability to see wonder and magic in the world around them, especially when people live in really big cities too. It can be hard, but I think for me, like from a very young age, I've always been able to appreciate like beauty and humor in the world around me. And I think that's something that you can build an awareness of. So one thing that I would recommend to people, for example, is like being able to appreciate elements of nature around them. So even if I'm living in, I mean, I've been really lucky to live in places like Perth where it's very clean, and also places like Shanghai that have really good town planning, and they incorporate a lot of nature into the way that the city is laid out. So there's always really luscious parks, there's always flowers and plants like along the highways. So I'm always looking to appreciate elements of nature around me. So if you decide that that's something that you want to do and you never really thought about it before, suddenly your awareness of nature becomes overwhelming. You recognize it everywhere. So that's your first stage. And then where anger might be as stage 2, you would have appreciation and awe. Then you can accept that, isn't it beautiful that there's so much nature around you in a way, and you're able to see it in a way that you didn't before. And then finally, there's action. What are you going to do moving forward? Continue to appreciate it. Maybe you want to contribute to your local community garden. Maybe you want to invest in buying plants for your home, whatever. I got off track again, but back to how to cultivate more spiritual self-care practices. So spiritual self-care to me, like I said before, it's not something that you can just buy in a product. It's not something that can be quantified, but it's still something that I think is worth doing and worth experimenting with and seeing what works for you. So for me personally, meditation is a huge thing. I try to meditate every morning as soon as I get up. Another thing with spiritual self-care, it's like focus less on the quality of the experience and more on the fact that you're even doing it at all. So meditation isn't necessarily going to be a fun experience, but it's still like a necessary part of my day for me to feel like, I don't know, my brain is set properly. When I'm meditating, it's not like you don't think, because to stop thinking is to like stop breathing, as Buddha or a monk or the Dalai Lama said. But it's just developing a practice of being able to sit in silence with your eyes closed and observing your thoughts. It's natural to start thinking and get into a thought loop, but then the very awareness of that thought is meditation. So I think a lot of the times people get confused and think that like, oh, I can't do meditation. Oh, I'm not good at meditation. It's not about being good or bad, love. It's just the fact that you even do it to begin with. Another thing, journaling. Journaling is underrated and overrated. Overrated because it's been turned into like a superficial self-care practice that like is part of the that girl trend, like the hyper aestheticization of self-care, to the point where it can feel like kind of cringe to talk about or even try to do. Like I have said before, in the context of things like being able to become aware of beauty standards, strip everything back to its most basic form, and then you can add spending on top of that. So when it comes to journaling, I buy just cheap $1, $2, $3 notebooks from the office supply store, Officeworks, if you're in Australia. And I use, a standard Pilot Acro Ball pen, which I buy refills for. And in the morning, the way that I started doing it was doing a 2-page thought dump in like A5 size notebook every morning. And I think when you're starting this out, start with 1 month minimum. Tell yourself on any day, okay, I'm going to do 1 month every morning, 2-page thought dump. And then just do it. Don't overthink it. Just set the time to do it. Maybe get a habit tracker chart or app or whatever so that you can check that you're doing it each day. Don't beat yourself up if you miss a day or whatever, but try to do it as many days as you can. If you fall off a day, try to get back on the next day. And just write whatever comes to mind. Don't judge what you're writing. You don't have to read over it ever again. I don't really read over stuff that I write in my journal, to be honest. Don't read over it if you don't want to. You definitely don't have to show anybody, but just the very fact that you do it is important. Don't get caught up in not being able to write anything. Just fucking write. If you have to write the same sentence over and over again, so be it. Fill those 2 pages and then see how you feel after a month. And I think it's best to do it like 1 to 3 months consistently first, and then start doing working through like different journal prompts. So one of the books that I've recommended in the past is The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden. I will link it in the description. But there are a lot of journal prompts in that book, which when I first read it, I did not do them. And then when I reread the book a year or 2 later and started doing the writing exercises, it really had a positive impact on my mental and emotional, spiritual well-being. Very important. So journaling is another thing. Another thing would be yoga. So yoga is both like spiritual and superficial. I say superficial because, I mean, everything can be made superficial, because then, the problem with journaling and the way that people talk about it and the way that it can be cringe is when it's all about having the most perfect $25 journal with an expensive pen, using pretty colors. Like, it doesn't need to be that complicated. Literally black, regular pen, blue pen, whatever fucking pen you want to write with, regular journal. You can write on scrap paper if you need to. Simplify to the bare basics. And then if you really love journaling and you want to invest more money into it, you can. But it doesn't matter how much money you spend on it. It's not going to change the fact that you need to do it. And it's not necessarily going to make it any more or less effective depending on the amount of money you spend on it, which is why spiritual self-care is like different to superficial self-care. So for yoga is like highly commercialized now. You can buy really expensive yoga clothes, you can go to expensive yoga classes, but you don't need to do all that to have a positive experience with yoga. If you are not naturally inclined towards yoga, or you've never done it before, or you feel very inflexible, just start with 10 minutes, free YouTube video, 10 minutes yoga stretch on YouTube. Yin yoga is like very low impact and focused on stretching and breathing and holding longer stretches. So that's an option. Don't worry about how it will affect your body, because I think yoga can also be associated with a form of weight loss. What you do for weight loss and what you do for your spiritual well-being, I think, are 2 different approaches. Yes, your spiritual practice can assist you in weight loss if that is one of your goals, but don't worry so much about that. Your spiritual well-being is much more important than whether you're skinny or not. Know this. But yeah, general health and well-being is a much better anchor to your self-care practices than just being hot and skinny or just being hot, because it will naturally contribute to your hotness anyway. How we define hotness, I can discuss in another episode, but I have spoken about how being hot does not equate to being respected. However, having a spiritual self-care practice will definitely help you to cultivate self-respect and learn to draw boundaries. Learning to draw boundaries and then build boundaries. So spiritual self-care is really important. What else can you do for spiritual self-care? I think meditation and journaling are a great start. I think if you just added those 2 things to your life, it would have a huge impact, but it requires you to be consistent and to be patient. So it's not like, oh, you journaled one time and then suddenly all your problems go away. Nothing really works like that. It's a practice for a reason, and there is no perfect, there is no day when you've written a perfect journal entry. You just have to do it and trust that it compounds into, facilitating your self-growth, your self-evolution. I feel like for me in the past, I would be good for maybe like a month or two, maybe 3, and then I would get distracted and derailed, and I would end up having to start the cycle again. I was stuck in this like 3-month cycle of like putting in effort and then getting discouraged or distracted and then getting angry at myself because I would end up in some kind of situation where I realized that I wasn't honoring boundaries that I needed to honor. And in the last year, almost 2 years, being consistent for longer than 3 months showed me that it was a practice. In practice, it showed me it was a practice by practicing. So be as consistent as you can and know that it's making a difference in subtle ways that compound, because you can't quantify spiritual growth because it does not exist like in the physical world, if that makes sense. Like, how do you, people will always try to attempt to quantify these things because we live in a capitalist society and it's fun to sell stuff and make money, but it doesn't mean that it's an accurate reflection of it. Like, there's no dollar value to the ways that I've grown or changed in the past, however long you want to describe it, but it doesn't mean that change isn't there. You know what I mean? I can't relate to me a month or 2 months ago ever, because I feel like I'm always trying to be consistent in my practice and continue to build awareness. And I try to take every day as an opportunity to learn new things, even if it's really small things. It's okay. So whether it's about myself or about the world or about other people, it doesn't matter. Life is like a fun project, you know? So I hope that this made sense. I hope that you feel somewhat inspired or motivated to either start or continue to practice spiritual self-care in conjunction with superficial self-care. I don't think one is better than the other. I think both are necessary. However, I feel like a lot of the times people focus only on superficial self-care and are not yet aware of how they could be tending better to their spiritual growth, spiritual well-being. So yeah, also like doing reading and just keeping an open mind to different perspectives, I think helps a lot too. Like, I don't necessarily see the world through any particular lens or ideology. I like to learn about different perspectives, see where the parallels are, and then figure out what works for me. Because at the end of the day, like, all the major religions and stuff, like, the core messages are the same. It's just the language and the stories that they use and the frameworks that they create to demonstrate the same basic principles differ across cultures, but I think the thesis is the same. And I think you only really truly understand it once you've put in the work. Just reading about it, just watching it doesn't equate to actually doing it. You know, like, I could read all the books in the world about how to make money, but if I don't get a job, then I'm never really going to know how to make money properly, right? I could read all the books in the world about attachment style, spirituality, but if I don't learn to be conscious of the language that I use, the way that I behave in my relationships, then it doesn't matter. You know, like, I think there was a study about people who study philosophy and whether or not they're like actually quote unquote better people, and that's not necessarily the case. The same way that a lot of the times, like, even the most well-intentioned people who might have a lot of knowledge about a certain topic are still ignorant to their own blind spots. Like, one of my favorite books, or this book that had a really big impact on me, which I talk about a lot, The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. I think I saw an article about how he cheated on his wife, but the way that he talks about the practice of love was so life-changing for me, and it's also quoted by bell hooks in All About Love. So, you know, there's also that psychologist, was it Jung or the philosopher Nietzsche. One of them that was like, just because I have the key to other people's awareness doesn't mean that I have the key to my own. And also that thing in the Bible that's like you can see the twig in someone else's eye, but not the log in your own. So we all have blind spots. Your journey is becoming aware of them and learning to heal them and being able to enjoy your life. So, all the best. Thank you for listening. Follow me on Instagram at AmberAkilla, on TikTok at AmberAkilla, on SoundCloud at AmberAkilla, on Instagram for this at friend.crush. Stay hydrated. Tell your friends and family that you love them and go be a better person. Bye.